big as life and smiling with his eyes, says Joe what they can never kill, went on to organize, went on to organize. From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill, where working men defend their rights, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. It's there you'll find Joe Hill.
Revolutionary, but you can't kill a revolution.
You said, Mr. Robeson, and I quote, I belong to the American resistance movement, which fights against American imperialism, just as the resistance movement fought against Hitler.
Just like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were underground railroaders and fighting for our freedom, you bet your life.
I have to insist that you listen to these questions.
I am listening.
I quote further, why should the Negroes ever fight against the only nation in the world where racial discrimination is prohibited and where the people can live freely? Never. They will never fight against either the Soviet Union or the people's democracies, close quote. Did you make that statement?
I do not remember, but what is perfectly clear today is that 900 million people, other colored people, have told you they will not. 400 million in India and millions everywhere have told you that.
The witness has answered the question. He doesn't need to make a speech.
Did you write an article that was published in the USSR Information Bulletin?
Yes.
Quote, I want to emphasize that only here in the Soviet Union did I feel that I was a real man with a capital M, close quote.
I would say, what is your name?
Aaron.
I am quite willing to answer the question. When I was a singer years ago, and this you will have to listen to.
I am listening.
I am a bass singer, so for me, it was Chelyabin, the great Russian bass, not Caruso the tenor. I learned the Russian language to sing their songs. I wish you would listen now.
Mr. Chairman, I ask you to direct the witness to answer the question.
Just be fair with me.
I ask for order.
The great poet of Russia is of African blood.
Let us not go so
It is
far
important to
afield.
explain this.
Did you make that statement?
When I first went to Russia in 1934.
Did you make that
When I
statement?
first went to Russia in
Did you
1934.
make that statement?
In Russia, I felt for the first time like a full human being. No color prejudice like in Mississippi. No color prejudice like in Washington. It was the first time I felt like a human being. Where I did not feel the pressure of color as I feel it in this committee today.
Why do you not stay in Russia?
Because my father was a slave, and my people died to build this country. And I'm going to stay here and have a part of it just like you, and no fascist-minded people will drive me from it. Is that clear?
You are here because you are promoting the communist cause.
I am here because I'm opposing the neo-fascist cause, which I see arising in these committees. Jefferson could be sitting here, and Frederick Douglass could be sitting here. Eugene Debs could be sitting here.
Now, what prejudice are you talking about? You were graduated from Rutgers. You were graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. I remember seeing you play football at Lehigh. There was no prejudice against you.
Just a moment. This is something I challenge very deeply, that the success of a few Negroes can make up for $700 a year for thousands of Negro families in the South. My father was a slave, and I have cousins who are sharecroppers. I do not see success in terms of myself. I have sacrificed hundreds of thousands of dollars for what I believe in.
In danger. We're here because we've been facing a really harsh and genocidal period. I don't think there's any other word for it. And it's why the committee went back and looked at the 1951 petition by the Civil Rights Congress that accuses the U.S. of racism against its African-American populations of color, really. We have an incredible program. The process will be that we'll have a short introduction, and then we're going to go into a keynote with Sharice Burton Shelley, and then each of the presenters will follow with Trevor, Sarah, Uju, Nelly, Ria, Amber, and Anje will be the order. I'd like to start by introducing Dr. Aaliyah Tyner Mullins, who has a personal connection, right, to the document. Aaliyah earned a doctorate in sociology at the CUNY Grad Center, and her area is alternative education models. She's part of the founding faculty at the Gutman Community College. Her research interests include the sociology of education, communities, sports, and cultural studies. She's the author of Enter the Alternative School, Critical Answers to Questions in Urban Education, an in-depth examination of public school alternatives to traditional education methods. She's the co-editor of Critical Small Schools, Beyond Privatization in New York, Urban Educational Reform. She's also the founding chair of the Gutman Community College, chapter of the PSC, and she's completing her second term as a member of the PSC Executive Council and bargaining team. Aaliyah.
So sorry for that introduction. Like my book titles are a little bit of a mouthful, I realize. I also want to apologize that I have to get to a class right after I speak. So I'm excited about being able to watch the recording this weekend, but I can't stay. So on behalf of the Executive Council and my own chapter, Gutman Community College, I would like to welcome everyone on the panel and the members of the audience. I would like to extend a very special welcome to Mary Louise Patterson, William Patterson's daughter, and an activist in her own right. I appreciate everyone being here to discuss this work that is regrettably still relevant 69 years later. I grew up hearing a lot about We Charge Genocide, so it was very exciting when international publishers decided to release a new edition, and they asked my father, Jarvis Tyner, who was then the vice chairman of the US Communist Party, to write the prologue. In it, he discusses the parallels between the rallying cries of Black Lives Matter and We Charge Genocide, which you'll hear more about today. My father also describes the convincing and well-documented evidence that showed what we all now see clearly, that racism in the US is not simply individual acts by racists, but a system of oppression. The more than 170 pages of evidence covers only the time period from 1945 to 1951. My father was briefly able to connect this work to the war on drugs, the 2016 presidential election, and the innumerable murders of Black people across the world and the country by police and racist vigilantes. Unfortunately, this chapter was submitted prior to the election of our current president, and the evidence around the world has only continued to multiply since then. I hope those of you who haven't read We Charge Genocide will take the time to read it, and those who have will read it again. I'm looking forward to hearing from the panelists as they engage you and each other in bringing this work into our present and connecting it to struggles around the world. As my father ends his prologue, the struggle must continue. It is a battle that must and will be won. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Dr. Mary Louise Patterson is the daughter of James Patterson, the founder and executive director of the Civil Rights Congress, editor of We Charge Genocide. William Patterson had worked on the Scottsboro 9 and Sacco and Bassetti case. He was persecuted and imprisoned for his leadership and lifelong commitment to socialism, especially after We Charge Genocide made American racism an international issue. He was a proud member of the CPUSA to his dying day. I recommend Gerald Horn's book, William L. Patterson, Black Revolutionary and the Globalization of the African-American Freedom Struggle. Hi, Dr. Patterson.
Hello, and thank you, Blanca, for such a beautiful introduction. I want to congratulate the Professional Staff Congress and their international committee for recognizing the imperative and the courage to organize and base this conference on the Civil Rights Congress's We Charge Genocide petition. It was written and presented by my father, the executive director of the Civil Rights Congress, and his dear friend and comrade in arms, Paul Robeson, to the world in 1951. Paul presented it to the United Nations here in New York City, and my father, William L. Patterson, traveled to Europe to present it to the United Nations in Paris. The US government got wind of Pat's travel plans and revoked his passport while he was abroad, which meant he should have returned home immediately. But he was undeterred. So with the aid of European friends and comrades, he managed to elude US authorities for several months, who chased him all over Eastern and Western Europe. But upon his return to New York, he was humiliatingly strip searched at the airport and his passport illegally seized. One of the photos that they were going to show was taken when Pat emerged from immigration and is being met by a welcoming committee, which include Paul Robeson. And there was a little girl standing there holding a doll, and that little girl is me. Shades of Kamala Harris's little girl. He wasn't to receive his passport again until 1960. That's Pat, my father. A full 9 years later, W.E.B. Du Bois, Robeson, and others were also illegally stripped of or denied new passports. And Paul was singled out for further public condemnation and ostracism, which must have contributed to his demise. They were being punished for not only exemplifying the best of the Black radical tradition. My father was a member of the Communist Party, but they were being punished for embarrassing the US government as well. Then in the 1970s, the Black Panthers approached my father with the idea of updating the petition. Unfortunately, that didn't happen then. So it's a task that demands to be undertaken now. I believe the petition is as relevant today as it was when written. Obviously, PSC does as well. For the US government has, since its inception, aided, abetted, or openly conducted genocide within our borders, on our borders, and beyond our borders. I thank PSC for inviting me and including me on the program, and look forward to hearing the presentations and the concluding action plan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe at the end, if people can stay a little while, we'll run the slideshow at the end, Samantha, right? Now it is my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Cherise Burton-Stelly, who is the 2020-2021 visiting scholar in the Race and Capitalism Project at the University of Chicago. She is currently an assistant professor of Africana Studies and Political Science at Carleton College. A scholar of political theory, political economy, and intellectual history, Dr. Burton-Stelly is the co-author with Dr. Gerald Horne of W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History. Her published work appears in journals, including Small Axe, Souls, Du Bois Review, Socialism and Democracy, International Journal of Africana Studies, and the CLR James Journal. She's very prolific. She's also the guest editor of the forthcoming Claudia Jones, Foremother of World Revolution, special issue of the Journal of Intersectionality. And she's a regular contributor to Black Perspectives, the award-winning blog of the African American Intellectual History Society. As a visiting scholar, she'll be completing her book manuscript, tentatively titled Black Scare, Red Scare, in which she examines the rise of the US to global hegemony between World War I and the early Cold War, at the intersection of racial capitalism, imperialism, anti-communism, and the super exploitation and oppression of Blackness. Dr. Burton-Stelly.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so sorry it was that long, how embarrassing. But I am so thrilled today. I'm trying to not like fangirl over Mary Louise Patterson. I'm trying to keep myself together. But thank you so much to the Professional Staff Congress International Committee for inviting me to speak here. I will do my absolute best to stick within the 10-minute time frame And also thank you to my illustrious co-presenters. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation that we'll have. I think it's very fitting we're giving our comments on the anniversary of the assassination of Chairman Fred Hampton and Mark Clark by the Chicago Police Department. They were assassinated, obviously, for their political views, which were very much, I would say, consonant with what is ensconced in We Charge Genocide. So I think that this is a great occasion.
What charge?
What? Okay, sorry. I think this is a great occasion to think about the bankruptcy and injustice of the United States, which the We Charge Genocide petition indicted. Of course, it was also around this time of year, December 17th to be exact, that the petition was delivered to the UN General Council, as well as the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and the UN Secretariat in NYC, December 17, 1951. And so I will just briefly speak about the political, ethical, and epistemological dimensions of We Charge Genocide, because it's very important to think about how do we struggle for power and resources, what are the values that shape these struggles, and how do we come to know and make claims about what it is we ought to struggle for. So that is what I mean by politics, ethics, and epistemology. I had some background information about the petition, but in the interest of time, I'll just briefly gloss over that the petition compiled a mountain of evidence documenting more than 150 cases of murder or state executions and more than 350 instances of beating, maiming, rape, or threats, only between the year of 1945 and 1951. And this, of course, was only a fraction of those actual occurrences. It also included appendices that documented how state officials worked with the KKK to disenfranchise Black people, the use of the charge of rape to politically and economically oppress Black people, the ways in which the monopoly control of the South made Southern people poorer than those in any other region of the nation, and also the refusal of Congress to enforce equal protection and therefore participating in the genocide of Black people. Briefly, the context in which the petition was drafted and circulated was the post-World War II demobilization and recession that coincided with the rise of anti-Black violence. This was when the Korean War was setting in, and there was also a fear of creeping fascism in the United States, and the increase in violence against Black people portended this creeping fascism. And of course, these conditions very much resonate with what's happening today. So I'll now turn to the politics of We Charge Genocide. And I'm gonna read just a small segment from The Man Who Cried Genocide, which is William Patterson's autobiography. He wrote, quote, "We in the CRC decided that the presentation of a petition charging the crime of genocide and thoroughly documenting what we regarded as the genocidal attitude of the US government toward its Negro citizens was timely. It will be helpful, we thought, to all peoples fighting for freedom, and would be particularly helpful here at home among both Black and white citizens, where the role of the UN was not too well understood or appreciated. It would also point out to Black men and women the broadening avenues through which their struggle might move forward." And so here we see the politics of the petition are internationalist in scope. They are geared towards consciousness raising among Black people and oppressed people, that there's a linked fate between what's happening to Black people in the US and what is going to happen as a result of US imperialism to other racialized and oppressed folks subjected to imperialism. It is geared towards Black liberation and the liberation of all oppressed people, and is deeply anti-imperialist. And so this indictment is an indictment of US imperialism, warmongering, and the sort of racial logics that animate that. Patterson went on to say, quote, "The petition, I thought, should expose the reactionary role that the racists of the United States were preparing to play in world affairs, especially its dangers to world peace. No government bound up with racism could want or seek world peace." And so here we see that the peace politics of the document are fundamentally bound up with the anti-racist politic. And contrary to the current liberal anti-racism that's circulating today, this was an anti-racism that was fundamentally predicated on the eradication of imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, anti-Blackness, and also the anti-communism that was reinscribing white supremacy. And so this is an anti-racism that's a broader project of human flourishing and not just about behaviors or attitudes. The document I've talked elsewhere about how the document is a critique of racial capitalism. I won't go into that now, but I'm happy to speak about that during the Q&A if people are interested. But in terms of ethics, ethics refers to well-founded standards of right and wrong that prescribe what humans ought to do, usually in terms of rights, obligations, benefits to society, fairness, or specific virtues, as well as the study and development of one's ethical standards. And so We Charge Genocide as an ethical document reveals that racial capitalism is deeply unethical and immoral, and that the conditions of Black people in the United States and the conditions of oppressed people subjected to US imperialism reveal the sort of moral bankruptcy of the United States. So a quote from We Charge Genocide is, quote, "The genocide of which we complain is as much a fact as gravity. The whole world knows it. The proof is in everyday newspapers and everyone's sight and in hearing in these United States. Yet the conscience of mankind cannot be beguiled from its duty by the pious phrases and the daily legal euphemisms with which its perpetrators seek to transform their guilt into high moral purpose." So here we can see that the petition is indicting the moral bankruptcy of the United States that's used to legitimate structural and material abjection of Black people, and it's offering a new sort of ethical orientation. And this is manifested in the fact that the petition was a collective, mass-based, people-oriented document. So this was not a sort of great man tone produced by one person, but it was collectively worked on, edited, and researched. And it also focused on atrocity against women, children, as well as men. And it was deeply focused on the working class and poor Black folks. Previous petitions of this type tended to emphasize that the particular crimes committed against respectable Negroes or the Black petty bourgeoisie, but this document focused on the attacks on and ravaging of Black workers and poor people. And so that is a sort of a collective anti-capitalist ethics in my perspective. It's also a courageous document, and courage is a very important ethic, I think. And as Dr. Patterson spoke about, those who prepared and circulated the petition paid dearly for that, but it was worth it because it was meant to sort of draw connections of reciprocal care and concern, both nationally and internationally. Finally, in terms of epistemology, this can be understood as a study of how we come to know, understand, believe, justify beliefs, and ascribe meaning to phenomena. And it's also concerned with the creation and dissemination of knowledge and the source of knowledge, as well as how knowledge is constituted. And so the philosopher Charles Mills talks about alternative epistemology that challenges pseudo-universalisms and comes from the minds of the oppressed, and it's meant to sort of offer a critical reinterpretation of the social system. And so we can see that We Charge Genocide very much fits into this description of alternative epistemology, not least because it emanates from the worldview and knowledge of those victimized by racial capitalism, not least because they have perhaps the most intimate knowledge of what the United States actually is. Not only this, the petition calls upon the knowledge and perspective of those in the UN General Assembly who are committed to justice, to reject US rhetoric about racial progress, and instead to really come to terms with its criminal attack on Black people. And so a quote from the petition is, quote, "Any delegate who has visited the capital of the United States at Washington, D.C., governed directly by the central government without benefit of local authority, knows of his own knowledge that segregation and oppression in violation of the Charter and the Convention is a policy and creature of the government of the United States." And so here we can see that the petition is calling on the UN General Assembly to use its own knowledge and its own deep sort of understanding of oppression and subjection to reject US hegemony, US warmongering, US exploitation, and to really commit itself to the justice that it purports to have. I am right at time, so I will stop there, but thank you so much, and I look forward to the conversation that is to come.
Wow, thank you so much for that, Dr. Sharice Burden-Stelly, an extremely enlightening and powerful introduction to the social history of the We Charge Genocide document, and for your brilliant analysis of the political, ethical, and epistemological lessons and the relevance of the document to our struggle today. You have helped us to frame our discussion today and have connected so many important dots, so thank you for that. I would also like to thank Blanca for the wonderful introduction, and Dr. Mary Louise Patterson and Dr. Elia Tyner for their extremely moving remarks about their personal connections to the We Charge Genocide document, and for taking the time to join us today. It is truly an honor to be participating in this event with you all today. I wanted to start off with a few words about the IC subcommittee on anti-racism that organized today's event on We Charge Genocide, just for a little bit of background context. As Dr. Patterson put it so eloquently, considering the US government's role in the ongoing aiding, abetting, and open conduct of genocide within our borders, on our borders, and beyond our borders, the We Charge Genocide petition is as relevant today as when it was first written. Our subcommittee came together in April to try to make sense of and respond to the devastation wrought by the combined health, economic, climate crisis, and the broader crisis of racial capitalism with its never-ending violence. In particular, the disproportionate and devastating impact of this combined crisis on the working class, and particularly Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color, and therefore disproportionately impacting CUNY, the largest and one of the most diverse public university systems in the US. CUNY suffered at least 38 deaths in its system during the pandemic, and many of New York City's tens of thousands of deaths also impacted our CUNY communities, as our students and workers lost family members. Many of our students also lost housing, jobs, healthcare, and over 50% of our students are currently worried about food insecurity. That's more than 3 times the rate in 2018. Although we live in New York City, the richest city in the world, in the richest country of the world, and at a time when the uprising is demanding an abolition of the racist police and other oppressive institutions, we have the most expensive police force in the United States. And if it were considered an army, it would be the 7th largest in the world. We know the issue is never about a lack of resources, but how those resources are distributed, which is a fundamentally political question. So at CUNY, in addition to the enormous loss of life, we also lost jobs. Thousands of adjuncts, as well as college assistants and other vulnerable campus workers, lost employment, and therefore many lost their healthcare coverage because of the inhumane healthcare system we have in this country. Cuts also impacted students with larger class sizes, fewer options, fewer advisors, as well as cuts to programs like SEEK that provide crucial support to our Black and Latinx students. And a reminder that our struggles are truly deeply interconnected. What became clear was that this crisis would be mobilized to push through a fundamentally racist project for restructuring CUNY that has its roots in the late 1960s, when Black and Puerto Rican student-led movements successfully fought to desegregate the university's admissions and decolonize its curriculum, as powerfully demonstrated by the film Making the Impossible Possible, which we were hoping to include a clip of in our introduction, and which I urge everyone to watch if you have the opportunity. The university administration responded to this movement with cuts and applying universal tuition, whereas CUNY had been free prior to that. So there is nothing new about the state or administration using the pretext of austerity to push through a racist restructuring that undermines the diversity and working class nature of this university. To truly address the genocidal dimension of the moment, we recognize the need for more than just platitudes, and that required thinking and working together with others who are already organizing across the university, with Black, Latinx, and other people of color, student and worker organizations leading the way, along with the PSC's Summer of Struggle campaign, as well as the powerful rank and file organizing across CUNY. Like so many others, we recognize the need to work together as well with the broader New York community to figure out what needs to be done materially, not only to protect this broader community of ours from the racist cuts and violence, and not only to return to the status quo ante, but to truly transform CUNY into a decolonized, abolitionist, working class, and anti-racist university capable of living up to CUNY's name as a people's institution. I would like to single out here one of our IC committee members, Doug Ferrari, for his foundational role in our group for suggesting that we use the term genocide to convey the urgency of the current moment. The concept made sense to all of us, especially considering the radical left history of the We Charge Genocide petition, which of course Dr. Patterson, Dr. Tyner, Dr. Burden-Stelly have also eloquently laid out. We consulted the petition for guidance in connecting the dots between the structural violence exposed and exacerbated by the health crisis, as well as the ongoing physical violence of the racist police and carceral state that we live under. Rereading the document, we were struck by how it painstakingly documented and substantiated Ruth Gilmore's definition of racism as the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. When we add the notion of accumulation through dispossession to this definition, we of course arrive at what many incredible freedom fighters and scholars have described as racial capitalism. Of course, Cedric Robinson looms large in this list. Our intellectual and organizing work is guided by all the towering figures and, to use Sharice's term, the collective labor of organizations and movements that have risked so much, including their lives, in the fight for Black liberation, and therefore for all of our liberation, and on whose shoulders we stand, including William Patterson and Paul Robeson, to Walter Rodney and Claudia Jones, to CUNY's own Audre Lorde. As trade unionists, we are particularly inspired by the labor organizations that hail from and have contributed to this tradition, including the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. Most recently, we were moved by the strike organized by the International Longshore and Warehouse Union on Juneteenth, to demand an end to white supremacy, police terror, and the plans to privatize the Port of Oakland. Of course, genocide in its accelerated forms, including through the hundreds of years of chattel slavery and of settler colonialism here in Turtle Island, to Palestine, to Algeria, and elsewhere, the genocide of Jim Crow and the genocide committed by this country's institutions of organized violence, including locally through the police and globally through imperialist warfare and border violence, to the slow genocide of the carceral state, of neoliberalism and its gutting of public institutions, and of the numerous forms of racialized structural violence laid out in the We Charge Genocide petition, including the denial of adequate housing, healthcare, and education. Genocide has always been central to the accumulation through dispossession that marks racial capitalism, which means that it has been central to capitalism, full stop, as of course all capitalism is racial capitalism. Dr. Sharice Burden-Stelly brilliantly and succinctly draws important connections to the accelerated and slow, local and global dimensions of racial capitalism in her recent monthly review piece with this definition. Modern racial capitalism, she argues, is a racially hierarchical political economy constituting war and militarism, imperialist accumulation, expropriation by domination, and labor super exploitation. Crucially, I think for our discussion today, she argues that the antidote to racial capitalism is anti-racist socialism. To conclude, I hope we can take up the task that Dr. Patterson alluded to in her introductory remarks of devising an action plan for fighting genocide. In particular, to think through what is our role as workers, as students, as people grounded in the university, but also in broader communities of struggle to resist this genocide. How can we use our collective power to radically transform or upend, put an end to these systems that exploit, oppress, and dispossess us? As we're having this discussion in the context of our union, the PSC, of course, one form of collective labor power that comes to mind is the strike, a tool that our comrades Sarah Raimundo in the Philippines and Trevor Phillips in South Africa will discuss in more depth as part of the struggles that they are involved in. I hope we will have a fruitful discussion around how we can center anti-racism as we and the the struggle, the fight against genocide as we organize towards more militant worker action here at CUNY and elsewhere around the country and around the globe. We are so fortunate today to have such an amazing lineup of speakers, of comrades who are keeping up the radical tradition in their own intellectual and organizing labor to help us think through these questions and more. Thank you again to Charisse and to all our wonderful speakers joining us today, and to the audience for taking the time to join us. I'm really looking forward to our discussions. Without further ado, I will pass the mic back to Blanca for introductions. Thanks again.
Thank you, Karina. We're going to actually focus in on the global nature of this struggle. It is not just some coincidence that when George Floyd was murdered in front of our very eyes, and I've never been able to look at that twice because I'm watching someone killed. People in the world arose. There were demonstrations, in the Middle East and in South America and in Asia and in Africa, everywhere, because racism is global as capitalism is. So we're going to go to Trevor Wani, who's from South Africa, who's a freedom fighter and climate warrior. So he fought against apartheid, and today he's a fighter for eco-socialism because capitalism is also attacking our planet. He's been a member of movements of struggle in South Africa and beyond, employed by labor and people's organizations, including the 1 Million Climate Jobs campaign in 2011. He was active in the World Social Forum when it was formed. He has a PhD in sociology from the University of Johannesburg, where he is employed as a lecturer and directs the Center for Sociological Research. He's co-edited a book with our own Emmanuel Ness and Luke Sinwell called Urban Revolt, State Power, and the Rise of People's Movements in the Global South. His book, Amakomiti, Grassroots Democracy in South Africa's Shack Settlements, is in press right now. Trevor. Oh. Wait, we don't hear you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, there we hear you. Okay.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so thank you for having me here. This is a real honor. Well, we also, in our part of the world, we have had our share of massacres. The most recent was genocide. The most recent was the Marikana massacre, which happened on 16 August 2012, where miners who were striking for a living wage were shot dead by police. But of course, there are many ways in which miners get killed. For example, in 1986, under apartheid, we had the Kinross mine disaster, where 177 miners died underground. Now, when the Marikana miners who were on strike were camping on a mountain, a trade union leader, Comrade Joseph Matunjwa, addressed the workers on that fateful day of the massacre. He went on his knees with the TV cameras on him and pleaded with the workers to leave the mountain. He said, "The lives of Black people are cheap. These police are going to kill you." Of course, the miners did not leave the mountain, and the police moved in and shot dead 34 miners. It is true, racial capitalism is a murderous system. It is indeed, as Paul Robson and his comrades argued in their petition to the United Nations, it is guilty of genocide. During the anti-apartheid struggle, various appeals were made to the United Nations, and some of these appeals had some success. For example, when apartheid was declared a crime against humanity. So today, among other things, I want to focus on what I call the hope of collectivism, the hope that is generated by collective struggle. So for example, over here, thousands of kilometers away, were inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement because we could see that collectivism, that determination to fight for a better deal, for a better society, inspired us all the way here in Africa. Hope of collectivism is about fighting shoulder to shoulder with your comrades, with our communities, behind a vision of alternatives, fighting for radical social change. Unfortunately, today, there are so many things that eat away at our hope. For example, the economic situation is very bad for the majority of people, especially for the working class and the poor. And now we have COVID-19, which is causing devastation. An important context for this suffering is because the capitalist system is in a rolling crisis. The capitalist class, the capitalist governments, they do not have solutions to the crisis. They cannot have solutions because they are looking for solutions within the ambit of their system. So they only discuss and debate and agree and disagree about how to manage the system, how to manage the crisis. Also, unfortunately, there is no strong challenge to their rule, the rule of the capitalists, the rule of private property, the rule of exploitation, the dominance of exploitation. There is no strong working class movement that has the power to challenge the capitalist class, to challenge their system of exploitation. There is no counter-hegemonic social force that has the authority to take power. And with the crisis of the capitalist system, there's a crisis of bourgeois democracy. That is why we see dictators and racists being voted into power. And we see how the gains of the working class, especially those workers gained after the Second World War, are being rolled back. And those parts of the world where people are fighting for those gains, which they never enjoyed, giving them these gains is being resisted. Now, it is important to point out that the gains, the rights and freedoms and benefits of so-called bourgeois democracy that workers enjoy, especially in the more advanced capitalist societies, did not come to workers on a plate. Although bourgeois democracy will argue that, bourgeois ideology will argue that the gains were because of bourgeois democracy. So at the center of bourgeois ideology is to deny the power and centrality of the working class as a social force. So workers are made invisible and their voices silenced, because we know that those freedoms were gained through organized struggle by workers, in America, in England, all over the world, post-Second World War. Now, the problem we face is that many of us, even if we are involved in the struggle, fighting for racial justice, fighting for climate justice, sometimes we fall into this trap of bourgeois ideology. So we tend to see the invisibility of the power of the working class. We only hear the silence of the working class. Of course, there are many reasons. Organized labor is weak, trade union leaders have sold out, etc., etc. But we should never lose sight of who are the producers, because nothing that is there in the world that we enjoy can exist without the producers, the workers. We saw this during COVID-19. While many people work from home, someone had to make sure that the lights were on, that there was enough energy to power the computers and our laptops. Jeff Bezos of Amazon made his millions delivering goods and services online, but it was real living workers, black and brown mostly, who had to drive around and deliver those goods. The frontline healthcare workers could not work from home. They had to be there physically tending to the needs of the sick. I think the crisis of COVID-19 was reminding us of the importance of the working people. Due to time, let me just rush to the end now, because I wanted to talk about the barricades of everyday life where everyone is fighting for survival. So what I want to say is that the Marikana massacre teaches us something. It teaches us how it is so easy for the transfer of pain, despair, and hopelessness from generation to generation, and how hard it is to transfer the hope of collectivism, the hope of fighting for a different kind of society from generation to generation. So the youth, they only feel the pain which they never actually experienced, you know, but they inherited from their parents, from their grandparents. But then when they fight behind that hope of collectivism, you know, they believe that they are doing something new. Of course, they are facing unique circumstances, but there's something also they inherit from the past. So with Marikana massacre, it was not just a moment. It was a time when ordinary workers, they mobilized in their thousands, and they fought even against barriers put by their union leaders, barriers put by the government and its labor laws to demand a living wage. They said it is better to die than to continue to live like this. They did not feel lucky that they have a job. They experienced their jobs as another form of suffering and pain, not an escape from suffering and pain. So the workers took risk, and even when 34 of their comrades lay dead, they continued on strike for 3 more weeks. So they were fighting for a decent, comfortable, safe life. Theirs was a revolutionary vision. So what I want to say is that I have no doubt that the crisis of capitalism, you know, it will mean that things will get worse for the majority of the people until, you know, the only thing to do is to erupt. And it is also clear to me that racial capitalism will continue to destroy the environment unless we replace it with eco-socialism. I think the first step is to say no to racial capitalism in total. The step taken by Paul Robeson and his comrades when they took their petition to the UN and declared the USA government genocidal, they were saying no to racial capitalism. And that act inspires us to move forward against the system of exploitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And on your hope of collectivism, right? We're gonna go to the Philippines, right? Sarah Raimundo, who works at Bayan, the New Patriotic Alliance International Desk, is an organizer for the International League of People's Struggles and chair of the Philippines Bolivarian Venezuela Friendship Association. She directs and teaches at the Center for International Studies, University of the Philippines. Sarah is active and a leader in organizing the current university strike in the Philippines that the PSC has issued a resolution in solidarity with. Sarah. And it's
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Can you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. We Charge Genocide resonates with the National Democratic Movement in the Philippines' current struggle against political vilification, particularly the tagging of above-ground organizations as communist fronts and the political vilification of both progressive and revolutionary alternatives to the current system of an export-oriented, import-dependent economy ruled by local compradors who broker for global finance oligarchs. This tandem has kept the Philippines an underdeveloped nation tied to structural adjustment policies, U.S. military bases, and U.S. counterinsurgency. To be tagged by the Philippine state under Duterte as a person who belongs to a communist front organization has meant murder, massacre, unemployment, displacement, imprisonment, torture, enforced disappearance. In the following, I wish to show that our quest for economic, political, and epistemic sovereignty is an undertaking that is not unique to the radical tradition in the academe. Rather, radical tradition in the academe is a modality of the struggle for transformative education, which in turn is a component of an anti-imperialist praxis. As has been mentioned earlier, organized faculty and students in various universities here in the Philippines are on strike. It is no longer possible to deal with schoolwork amidst the challenges of remote learning, which is supposed to be a safety precaution as we struggle to survive the pandemic. This situation is compounded by the Philippine government's criminal negligence inflicted upon the people who were victims of two recent super typhoons. The strike was initiated by students in mid-November, called for the revitalization of relief efforts through the principle of no person left behind, meaning those who were not affected by the devastation should focus on relief efforts, arguing that solidarity, compassion, and empathy are significant components of academic honor and excellence. Going beyond the walls of the virtual classroom also means holding this government accountable for its crimes against the people. The strike therefore envisions and practices a disruption of normative academic activities toward building the general strike that responds to the call of mass organizations to end tyranny in the land. And we are infinitely grateful to the PSC for your full support and solidarity. And as we strike, we're also learning from the peasant uprisings and workers' agitation, which erupted as soon as the American soldiers wiped out the last pockets of revolutionary resistance. These uprisings were testament to the growing disquiet under the new colonial regime. So-called American liberation in 1945 and the granting of formal independence in 1946 signified a return to business as usual, of anti-communism coming from the West, but as Colleen Woods argued, served as one of the leading laboratories for the production of anti-communist discourse by diplomats, counterinsurgency experts, professors, administrators, missionaries, and social workers, providing models for use across the world. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the initial disparate protests in the universities centered on particular grievances was later anchored in a wider critique of imperialist domination and unjust social structures, enabling the emergence of mass struggles and movements. This radicalization found its strongest impetus in the global wave of Marxist-inspired national liberation struggles that reached an apex in the 1970s. And the goal was to build a progressive university within the reactionary university. In the Marxist-Leninist tradition, radical students posed the problem of the masses. How can a political force come to be present among the enormous masses of Philippine society? How are we supposed to establish relations with this huge mass of exploited and oppressed mass of people? The founding of this organization, which would later expand on a national scale beyond the exclusive prestige of the University of the Philippines, was a praxeological framing of youth in order to inform an understanding of the processes of revolution in a semi-feudal, semi-colonial setting. It combined the revolutionary principles of 19th and 20th century world revolutions, the urgency and leading role of the workers' movement, and the economic and political emancipation of colonized people comprised by a mass of landless peasants. The need for a movement on a national scale that could fulfill this mission was realized when the Kabataang Makabayan, or Patriotic Youth, was established on November 30, 1964. Since then, it has been the comprehensive youth organization, not only for university-based students, but also for the youth among the peasants, workers, professionals, and women. The revolutionary upsurge of this era spurred anti-imperialist institutional projects promoting the national language, local and popular histories and cultures, and social investigations into the conditions of marginalized sectors. These efforts persisted despite the Marcos dictatorship suppression of radicalization in academic sites, which would dovetail with the intensification of the commercialized and labor export orientation of Philippine education necessitated by the requirements of neoliberal globalization. has reduced democracy to what we are calling a populist discourse in circulation. It is a discourse peddled by the Duterte regime. It highlights the conflict between the people and a powerful bloc that is intent on marginalizing the people. There is reason to disbelieve the abdication of the revolutionary armed struggle, especially by this government. It is a reactionary claim that became hegemonic alongside the Philippines' participation in the WTO and other multinational institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and got WTO's dispossession of the Global South will not be as successful without the constant rejection and dismissal of the revolutionary struggle of the Filipino people. So what of education workers and students? Our force constitutes a potentially broad anti-imperialist movement that is being weighed down, yet also enabled by the contradictions that obtain from the simultaneity of structural stasis and destabilizing changes. Yet our sectoral struggle is less a revolutionary solution than a problem to solve for the Philippine Revolution. While the university played a pivotal role in the organization of political resistance, it cannot play a decisive role in making a rupture in the relations of production in Philippine society. The common thread that ties the presence of militant organizations in the university to its past and future is their resolve to unite with a comprehensive program for national liberation against US imperialism and peace based on social justice. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. You know, it's about 4 a.m. in the Philippines too. Thank you.
It is.
Uju Agorgo is an assistant professor of anthropology and experiential learning at the New School. Her research examines questions related to public education, urban space, racial capitalism, rights, gender, and the state. Uju also brings over 20 years of working to build local and national organizations and initiatives that work for educational justice, immigrants' rights, and transformative justice, as well as projects that focus on the intersectionality of arts and social justice, popular education, and adult literacy. She's completing her first book, The Color of Choice: Race, Rights, the Structure of Citizenship, and Inequality in Education, a historically informed ethnography of choice as it emerged in the post-civil rights period in the US. She's currently also an advisory board member of the Parent Leadership Project and a board member of Teachers Unite.
So, hello, greetings everyone. And thank you so much for inviting me. I am incredibly honored to be joining you all. And thank you to the PSC International Committee and the Subcommittee on Anti-Racism for putting this incredible forum and important discussion together. I hope we continue past today and our time together. So I am going to talk to a couple of the questions that you presented us with. The first being the question of kind of intellectual and political traditions that shape our work, and then a little bit about kind of how we think about what we might learn from past struggles for our contemporary present moment. So just hopefully briefly, the first question, I just wanted to talk about the importance of mentorship and its importance to me and those I came up with in the 1990s and early 2000s as an organizer in New York City, where I was fortunate to be mentored at that time and after by a real spirit of generosity and intentionality that was, again, incredibly important for me and so many others. So it wasn't just that we learned, for example, about liberation movements that we looked to from books alone, but we learned about it from those who had participated in those struggles and who continued with great humility and perseverance to be part of ongoing organizing and in community. And again, with a strong commitment both to the work and to building kind of the next generation. And for many of us, that made a profound difference in terms of how we understood the world, ourselves, ideas of solidarity, of relationality, and what was possible. And I see, I was chatting earlier with Lumumba Bandele, who's part of this program as well. So who's part of that community that I learned so much from. And it was then, of course, this then impacted how we understood what Ruth Wilson Gilmore has called an infrastructure of feeling, right? And for her, this is how do we intentionally choose and select the ancestors we call forward, the liberation lineages we step into, and how we interpret and imagine our possible futures, what we are building on and what we're calling forward. And that these movements were also not only rooted in communities of color and in building racial justice, but also had a profound and strong commitment to internationalism and anti-capitalism, was wedded and intertwined with a profound localism, taught us to think about the meaning and power and work of organizing, the importance of accountability and being grounded and rooted in your politics and work and the stakes therein, but also understanding then solidarity not simply as a principle or theory or buzzword, but really as a practice, right? That our local work only had meaning if we were working in coalition and in solidarity with one another. And then finally, mentorship also meant sharing what had been hard and challenging. So learning from the struggles and the challenges that others had faced, and thinking really critically about what type of power did we want to build. So building on what has been talked about earlier from comrades in South Africa and the Philippines. Thinking about what power are we putting forth, what alternatives are we, what is the world we are not just demanding, but building. And so for us, that meant how we thought about power and patriarchy in movement spaces, and also thinking about how we build on already existing forms of leadership and knowledge within communities. So drawing on traditions of SNCC, of Ella Baker, but also of Paulo Freire. And for many of us who came from immigrant families, that also meant looking to third world liberation movements, their visions and fights for freedom, but also the constraints that they encountered and the solidarity that they were able to build and forge together. And that then informed for many of us the work we did, but also the work, how I approach the question of public education, which is the second theme that I want to touch on briefly, that again relates to how we think about this contemporary moment. So one of the things that I ask my own students to do, and that I try and do, is to think then, what was the desire behind the demand? So how do we go beyond what was lost, what was won, to the real freedom dreams, as Robin Kelly instructs us to look to, of what movements we're working to build? How do we look for and contribute to the long and often invisible groundwork that informs those struggles, and how that groundwork can help us locate ourselves on what Grace Lee Boggs has called the clock of the world, right? How we then understand short-term strategies and our immediate work as part of a longer, again, work of a longer freedom vision and the grounded work that makes that possible. So in the case of education, for example, what can we look to by looking, or what can we learn by looking to the work of, for example, the 9 Black mothers who in 1958, May Mallory among them, who risked jail time for refusing to send their children to schools that they were certain would harm them? How did their risk and refusal made against and within claims to the racial state, and informed by, as I look in my own work, a vision of the urban commons, present us with a way of thinking about relationality that extends beyond the enclosures that are endemic to racial capitalism. How can it help us see the two sides of what Ruth Wilson Gilmore has called the two sides of the same coin: organized abandonment and organized violence, and though also the what we might envision and fight for otherwise. And growing out of then the movement, the struggle of the mothers of the Harlem Nine comes then many other struggles, right? The movement for community control of schools among them, which presents us with a kind of a model, a multi-scalar method and model for how we can think about a citywide demand for schools that reflect, respect, and serve the communities that they're part of, but that was also articulated on a very local level, right? About how kind of local work needs to inextricably be tied to and grow out of a community's history and what racialized dispossession looked like and how that shaped a given community's history. So how do these struggles then and these histories help us think about not only what we want to defend in terms of public education institutions, but also what we want to transform, right? What is it that we are working to fight for? So in the United States, we know that public infrastructures like education have historically worked as sites of racialized dispossession. They also present us with a terrain of struggle over what our social relations might be, what we can fight for, right? And it's not an accident that liberation movements from the Zapatistas to the Cuban Revolution to the long Black freedom struggle in the US to indigenous communities in the United States have identified education as a means, method, and site of struggle. And in the United States, we know, as W.E.B. Du Bois documents, that the first universal public schools were set up by Black communities in the Reconstruction period, right? A testament to what Du Bois and Angela Davis call abolition democracy. So if we think about then our present, right, we have some folks who say that, oh, this present kind of neoliberal education reform that we confront today is a result of a private pact made between Democrats on one side who sacrificed integration and Republicans on the other side who sacrificed some privatization kind of schemes to come up with a kind of alignment about how they would expand markets in public education. But we know that racial justice is never divorced from questions of economic justice. And as a piece that Karina and Angel kind of shared, the incredible piece that they wrote, and We Charge Genocide and its connection to the struggle and fight for CUNY, is that we also know that racial violence is always a question of labor. It can't ever not be, right? But then the reverse, if the reverse is also true, this means that our organizing has to reflect as much, right? So as an incoming Biden administration kind of pivots towards unions in education, it may feel like a moment to breathe for some, right? After the kind of aggressive tax that DeVos has put forward to hollow out public education in the United States, to get rid of it essentially, and her attacks, her kind of also attacks on workers. I think it raises for us then a question as those committed to, again, economic and racial justice and broad liberation, how do we learn from kind of the work undertaken, for example, by unions in Chicago and LA to build deep relationships of mutuality and accountability, holistic understandings of education that reach beyond the walls of any one school, that are far from symbolic, but really central to the struggles waged by labor and to their success in those instances, right? And then finally, how do we learn from struggles in the Global South, such as those that we've been able to hear from today, as well as many more, right? That can be understood as a bellwether for the struggles we now face in education and elsewhere. How does it help us ground our already connected struggles to one another, invoking, again, the tradition being called forward by We Call Genocide. So thank you, and thank you again for organizing this event.
Thank you. That was astonishing. Ria Rahman is an assistant professor of anthropology and a member of the Anti-Racist Coalition at Brooklyn College. Her research and teaching focus on transnational practices of racialization, and forefronts the question, how is human difference used for justifying systems of inequality and oppression? And how might we instead engage difference with an eye towards liberation? She is currently working on a manuscript that frames international Muslim volunteerism, humanitarianism, and development through intersection logics of global white supremacy, anti-Muslim racism, and anti-Blackness. Ria.
Thank you. Thank you, Blanca. Thank you to the PSC International Committee and this illustrious list of speakers. I'm really honored to be a part of this event. I also, like Uju, wanted to respond to some of the prompts about background of my own intellectual and political traditions that shaped how I'm organizing. I've often said about my scholarship that where I am now came despite my academic training and not because of it. During my graduate studies at the New School, I was teaching a course on the politics of aid in Africa. In 2015, I had a Black woman activist student who was active in the uprising in Ferguson, who gave me some pushback to a lot of the white Africanist scholars that I was using on my syllabus. And, you know, of course, initially I was defensive about it, but after I got over my own white adjacent fragility, I started to think, why didn't I have more continental perspectives on my syllabus? I started to read scholarship from what I now consider the Black radical tradition, and you know, things that I hadn't been assigned in my academic training up to that point. So I was introduced to Du Bois, to Walter Rodney, to Kwame Nkrumah, to Lumumba, to figure out what were African scholars and thinkers, what were their perspectives on what it meant to develop Africa. And largely coming from this position that Africa doesn't need your saving, it needs the rest of the world to stop exploiting and stealing the resources and labor from the continent. In particular, as a scholar of humanitarianism, also influenced by the work of Sylvia Winters, and realized, you know, I couldn't think about what it meant to be human without thinking of it as a essentially exclusionary category, that what defines the human is that whom is not considered human. And I started to reframe my thinking and to see and evaluate white supremacy as the baseline of the modern world. And to see and understand the ways that people tried to understand the world was inherently tied to the ways of dominating it, and through, in particular, white supremacist, settler, colonial, patriarchal capitalism. I often cite the poet Guante that once said, "White supremacy is not a shark; it's the water." Given this understanding of white supremacy, I personally wasn't active in organizing until this past spring with the PSC, when Brooklyn College, with its particularly financially conservative administration, was the first senior college in CUNY to announce job cuts due to budgetary constraints due to the COVID crisis. I was a member of the Cut COVID Not CUNY team. But following the national uprising sparked by the murders of George Floyd and Tony McDade and Breonna Taylor and so many more this past summer, myself and other concerned faculty, staff, and students on campus started to more forcefully push this connection between austerity and structural racism, and in particular, anti-Blackness. In my intro to anthropology class, I recently assigned the chapter "Brooklyn College Belongs to Us" by Martha Biondi about the Black and Puerto Rican, and I don't say this to invisibilize Afro-Puerto Rican or Afro-Latinx folks, but to acknowledge non-Black Puerto Ricans. The struggle in the spring of 1969, my students were shocked to learn that in the spring of 1968, the student population of Brooklyn College was 96% white, and that the reason that that CUNY looks as racially diverse, at least amongst the student body, that it does, was because of these brave action of these students and concerned faculty and community members at the time. Whereas CUNY, you know, begins with the recognition that public education should not be accessible only to the wealthy. From the origins of the Free Academy in 1847 up until the uprising in 67, this accessibility to higher public education was limited to the white working class. In the context of current anti-racist struggle on campus, reading about this uprising and the origins of the departments of Africana and Pearls at Brooklyn College that came out of these direct actions, it literally felt like Groundhog's Day. The students in 1969 were asking for a community-controlled education that, for example, the student group, the Puerto Rican Alliance, advocated for in their initial statement that they sent this past summer, and that ARC has adopted as part of our organizing strategy. And yet, from the very beginning, those departments that were created through direct action have been systemically underfunded and undervalued. Despite not replacing professor lines in both of those departments, our administration still will not commit to giving the first professorship lines available to Africana and Pearls. The administration today is responding in strikingly similar ways as they did in 1969. One of the biggest issues we're facing in our organizing with ARC is around the issue of shared governance and community accountability. Every time ARC has organized an event, this very same day, the administration has come out with an email about their own anti-racist agenda and their own anti-racist committee. One major problem that we recognize is that the leaders of anti-racist organizing on campus, including many of the professors who identify as critical race scholars and leaders among student activists, are not included in the administration's anti-racist committee. I think for folks, you know, and there's also the issue of coercion and retaliation to our more precariously employed staff, in which staff members might feel pressured by their supervisors to participate in an administrative-led anti-racist plan. So it's becoming increasingly clear, I think, that the administration is primarily interested in virtue signaling and not actually addressing the structural inequality, violence, and harm that is the status quo. So having read this article and watched, as others have mentioned as well, the incredible documentary film, Making the Impossible Possible, also about the struggle for one of the first Puerto Rican studies departments in the country, what seems to me striking about the differences with the struggle that happened in 1969 is the success of the multicultural neoliberal turn. Whereas white supremacy has adapted so that today one does not have to be racialized as white to be a white supremacist. And here I'm thinking of Obama's recent critique of defund the police. Andrea Smith has written about the distinction between a politics of recognition that for people of color or marginalized folks that seek recognition within the white supremacist structure, as opposed to a politics of liberation that's committed to the abolition of the status quo and the creation of something new. The Anti-Racist Coalition, we started off with 6 holistic demands, and we were very adamant that the demands are holistic, no more important than the other. But with the start of the semester and demands due to racial austerity, we realized we had to focus on one demand at a time. And so as such, we concerted our efforts to bring in outside consultants. And I want to be clear, this isn't for an anti-bias training or for a workshop as the admin is promoting, but for a full institutional restructuring as done by one group that we're considering as the African American Policy Forum. So we've been using a petition to garner wider support to bring in an outside institution, because we recognize this kind of change cannot come from within the very hierarchical structure that we're trying to fight in the first place. And in that circulating of the petition, we do face challenges from colleagues who, for example, really uncomfortable with the word white supremacy even in the petition, and many who feel personally attacked at the acknowledgement that the college is racist. This is a challenge to get beyond depictions of racism as individualized, personal, and largely about hate or bias, but rather to acknowledge white supremacy as and in terms of where to go from here. Another quote I often share by Assata Shakur is that nobody in the world, nobody in history has ever gotten around the more people that were oppressing them. In terms
All right, Ria, we're having a little difficulty. You just froze. Can she hear us? Samantha, do you know if she can hear us? Or are we disconnected?
I think we disconnected.
There we go. She's back. Okay.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah, it froze.
Okay, sorry about that. Let me just get back to where I was. I was closing out. I just wanted to say one initiative I was proud to take part of, along with my abolitionist colleague at the GEC, Naja Arzenberg-Guyot. We worked with an incredible group of students, one of whom is a comrade I'm proud to organize with, Daniel Vasquez Zanabria, in writing an op-ed about the violent and racist policing at CUNY. As a tactic to, we were thinking about how do we garner more attention towards racist policing. And so we worked with this group of students and have it published in the Abusable Past blog. But beyond that, I just wanted to close with this. Despite the criminalization of resistance, we do have to fight, and we do have to fight in solidarity. And it becomes increasingly clear to me, and I think a number of my comrades, that short of direct disruptive action, we will not see the change in our world that we so desperately need. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we're going to Nellie Bailey, and we're making this connection between my community struggles and university struggles. And one of the things our students are confronting right now, of course, not only food insecurity, but housing insecurity. The moratoriums on housing are going to be ending soon, and we may have a wave of evictions and perhaps a wave of resistance to evictions. Nellie Bailey is the former host of Black Agenda Radio with Glenn Ford. From her early organizing with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, to tenant rights and anti-war struggles, to advocacy on behalf of women, Bailey has been at the forefront of social justice and social change organizing. She was co-founder and executive director of the Harlem Tenants Council and co-founder of Blacks in Solidarity Against the War, that in 2005 helped to stage the largest anti-war demonstration in Harlem since the invasion of Iraq. In 1994, Bailey was an election observer of South Africa's first democratic election. Hi, Nellie.
Thank you very much for inviting me. The presentations have been illuminating. That's the word. First, I would like to say two giants, icons who who represent the epitome of the Black liberation tradition are James Baldwin and W.E.B. Du Bois. And I think it's important to talk about or to enter the names of those two iconic figures in our discussion, in any narrative that we have. The U.S. was never and has never been a constitutional democracy, a constitutional republic. It was a settler colonial state. That's what it was, that's what it is, and that is what it will continue to be unless class struggle ushers in a new system of government. That's the way it is. On the issue of homelessness, right now we have a study from 7 institutions, including MIT, University of Arizona, 7 distinguished institutions who predict a 30 to 40 million Americans are at risk of homelessness. Here in New York City, pre-pandemic, there were 14,000 eviction cases in landlord-tenant housing court in New York City. Post-pandemic, there are 200,000 cases. The courts issue edicts every day that are different. So if you are a working class person, most of these eviction cases encompass working class people. You don't have a clue what to expect. There is a digital divide in our community. So many of these renters who are behind in their rent do not have access to computers. There is, in fact, a digital divide in our communities, but the statistics are grim, and I don't see how, other than class struggle, and certainly not in alliance with the Democratic Party, certainly not the Republican Party, nor do I believe the Green Party will get us out of this hellish downward spiral, and it will only get worse. 100,000 people who are now hospitalized. We have 10 million people who are Americans who are unemployed. And even though they juggle the employment data, it is not a true picture of the unemployment landscape in this country. I think Chris Hedges said it well on his farewell tour of America. So I'm not optimistic. Joe Biden, President-elect Joe Biden certainly is not an answer. The Democratic Party is not, let me repeat, and will never be an answer to the class struggle that we have to wage. Without that, we are doomed, absolutely doomed. Here in New York City, through the $2 trillion CARES package that was allocated under the Trump administration, New York in its share of the CARE allocation, allocated $100 million to help indigent renters who couldn't pay, renters who were looking for help. First of all, the notice went out only 2 weeks. Only 40% of the people who applied qualified. So it, in essence, was a hoax. They had no intentions of aiding and helping working class people, Black or white. The situation in the city, of course, is dire, to say the least. We know that 300,000 New Yorkers from the 5 boroughs have applied for a change of address. That's 300,000. The city has a long way to return to its pre-pandemic status. I don't think it ever will. I don't think that is going to happen at all. But just let me say a couple of things in terms of how we organize, how we perceive, and especially racialized or racial capitalism. And someone mentioned Robin Kelly, who wrote a tremendous, wonderful tribute to the late Professor Cedric Robinson, who wrote Black Marxists. And Robinson, the late professor, is really interesting because he parted company with Marx in that, according to Robinson, capitalism existed in feudal Europe. It was there. And we know in feudal Europe, they did not have Black slavery, but they had the serfs, the Jews, the Irish, and whatever. It was only the modern day transatlantic slave trade that the oligarchs, the capitalist oligarchs, escalated, or the exploitation, and that is one of captured forced labor in this country that in fact built this country. And so it's important to look at, in my opinion, if we're looking at solutions, not that those solutions that are coming from the Democratic Party elite, the Black misleadership class, the Congressional Black Caucus. These are organizations and formations that have traditionally sold out Blacks. Traditionally, they are in service to the national security state. That's who they are in service to, as are many of the non-for-profit members of the non-for-profit industrial complex. They are funded by the democratic machine, the democratic apparatus, and that is who they serve, exactly who they serve. So there's no relief from those channels. There's no relief whatsoever. Another thing I wanted to add, someone mentioned Fred Hampton, which I think is key, because Hampton was a true socialist. You can't call yourself a socialist or a communist and you're voting for Barack Obama or Bill Clinton. I just do not get that analysis, not at all. And part of the, not part, but rather the problem of the left in this country, and if any of you have not read Tony Montera's piece in Black Agenda Report, I suggest that you do so, is that we must take on this Black misleadership class. I know people have great things to say about the Black Lives Matter movement. And this can cause you great consternation, demonization, and hatred. I've encountered it all because I did not and would never vote for Barack Obama nor Joe Biden. They are not the answer to the working class push, to the austerity bottom, to the austerity abyss. That's the word that I'm looking for. Not at all. Now, I was in South Africa. I was an election observer, and the problem with what Nelson Mandela did and the ANC as the Secretary of Defense of South Africa, Ronnie Carcel, I believe is how you pronounce his last name, is the Faustian bargain. The ANC agreed to assume the apartheid debt. Why would they do that? There was no land reform, none whatsoever. And assuming the apartheid debt meant you were paying off the workforce pension of the white South Africans. That's what you were doing. And if we can't begin to look at our leaders critically, and this isn't to say anything against Nelson Mandela, but Winnie Mandela was the person there who was advocating on behalf of Black working class South Africans who to this day do not have line, to this day continue to suffer under apartheid, to this day. So if we're going to, as not the participants in this discussion, but if we're going to gloss over the ineptness, if we're going to gloss over the sellout, the Faustian bargains that are heaped and negotiated on behalf of our people, that do not lift them out of even the most dire poverty, then what have we accomplished? What have we accomplished? The Democratic Party, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama? In my humble opinion and my working with working class Blacks, they are miles ahead of Black intellectuals who have no identity with their struggle, with their pain. It is addressed from a distance, not one of involvement. And that has to change. How do we marry the Black intellectual with the Black working class? It can't be in language that is not understood by the workers. It has to be something different. I hear so often references or people, intellectuals, opining about the revolutionary Black working class. They don't have a clue. They're not involved in any organizing of working class communities. I was in a student organized by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC, when its infamous expelling whites, said, go into your communities, organize your working class constituents, organize workers in these communities. That was 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago. And what have we? We have allowed, as the left, I don't include myself, it has been allowed that whether people like it or not, 70 million people who voted for Donald Trump, who also voted for Barack Obama, have been assigned to a basket of deplorables. And the left went along with it. Here we have the US left working with the national security state to defeat Donald Trump as if he encompasses, as if he embodies all of the evils and wrong of US imperialism.
Thank you, Nellie. That was so enlightening. Amber, all right, so we're going to Amber Rivero, who's the student government president at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She's majoring in political science with a concentration in law, courts, and politics. Amber has held various student leadership positions at John Jay College and at CUNY. She's vice chair of the Senior College Affairs at the University Student Senate, and she's a tireless advocate and lobbyist for student rights to resources, access, inclusion, and basic human rights outside of their college experience. She also goes to Albany and works with the University Student Senate. Amber is also a human trafficking survivor, advocate, and researcher. She has dedicated her professional and academic career to provide awareness and prevention strategies for all forms of gender-based violence and creating a survivor-centric policy culture at levels of institutional governance. This summer, she served as consultant researcher for the Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force. Amber's future academic and professional goals are to obtain a master's in arts degree in human rights and continue to lobby for legislative reform in the fields of gender-based violence eradication, survivor support, criminal justice reform, and higher education for formerly incarcerated individuals. Amber.
Thank you so much. Sorry that my bio was also kind of long. I appreciate that. So thank you to the International Committee of PSC and Professor Karina Mullen, my favorite professor at John Jay, for inviting me to be here as a student organizer and leader. It's an honor to be here and represent the students of John Jay and CUNY. alongside all of the amazing panelists and faculty members here today. I'm also grateful for the sacrifice and advocacy that brought about the We Charge Genocide petition and aimed to hold the United States government accountable for the crimes against the African American community that our country is entrenched with. However, I am grieved that in 2020, we are still having to bring this petition to the present day conversation as a continual struggle for safety and freedom from oppression and violence. As an individual who has life experience with the violence of exploitation our society still harbors, I'm dedicated to fighting tirelessly for the liberation and affirmation of all oppressed peoples in our country and institutions. To bring it back to CUNY as a student leader, I'll share a few initiatives that we've been working on this semester with John Jay in the fight for an anti-racist, more inclusive, and decolonized experience at John Jay and the CUNY system as a whole. The continuation and advocacy from previous student government administrations of the students are asking to consider changing the name of John Jay to reflect a member of American and New York history that has no ties to known slavery. A lot of people bring up in our advocacy and ask his later shift to abolition in life, but for the majority of students at John Jay, we demand someone be honored that reflect true advocacy on societal injustice and not ideological contributions to the abolition of slavery. Honoring Audre Lorde as a former faculty member and a Black feminist in John Jay is one alternative that has been offered. Another initiative that we've been supporting is the Black Student Union's demands this year that all of the departments and chairs take a more intentional look at the curriculum and encourage an anti-racist, culturally affirming, and inclusive curriculum be introduced at each of John Jay's academic departments. We are also fighting for the removal of the John Jay statue from the atrium, which is a central point of access throughout the campus, as it stands for a visual microaggression to a lot of our BIPOC students who do not particularly want to be reminded of that part of our country's history daily at an institute that we pay tuition in. Another ask that we've been advocating for is the inclusion and instituting of a Black Lives Matter and Fierce Advocates for Justice wall as a permanent fixture to pay tribute to all of the advocates that have led on the front lines of fighting for human rights and social justice, not only this year, but throughout the history of John Jay. Lastly, at the local level and university, we ask that our formerly incarcerated students and justice involved students be mentored, supported, and destigmatized in the system to affirm their right and all of our rights to higher education that we each deserve. I also serve in the capacity of University Student Senate Vice Chair of Senior College Affairs, and I've been actively working to help support a student coalition called CUNY Abolition for Safety in their advocacy to not only diminish or abolish the police presence in all of our institutions, but to call for a safer and more inclusive experience for African American students within CUNY. Most of us know the history of CUNY and the activism that took place in the late 1960s for Black and brown students to even gain access to the university system and win the open admissions fight. However, we believe that there's an organizational culture that is remnant in CUNY and some spaces that reflects either a tokenizing of our students of color or a tolerance of our students of color. In the year 2020, Black Lives Matter has unfortunately become a common slogan for so many to speak support of and so many people across CUNY and the city to say they are allies of. The students of CUNY are asking you to please put your money where your mouth is this year and in support of our many advocacy efforts and ask of the university, our local campuses, and our elected officials. How can you support us to create a more equitable and anti-racist institution for all students to enjoy? It could start by supporting the New Deal for CUNY, which is a way that the community can support the work of anti-racism and decolonization of CUNY, ensuring the diversity of our faculty at CUNY and also the advancement of full-time positions in CUNY for our minoritized faculty members is key to being a part of the change. Mentorship and research opportunities for our students of color, sharing the access that you may all have gained with those of us who are withheld that ease of accessing these really important opportunities to our academic career. Some actionable ways to support student leadership in our fight for racial equity and our rights would be standing in solidarity with the most recent resolutions on your local campus that University Student has passed, affirming the credit, no credit, or flexible grading policies to support our students in their hardest semesters of colleges. Another way to support students in eradicating racism and anti-Blackness is by supporting the USS resolution calling for the university's divestment from Corecraft fiscally, and for CUNY to no longer support a corporation that is rooted in the exploitation of our incarcerated individuals, which is considered labor trafficking of majority Black and brown New Yorkers. I look forward to the actionable support that you can provide this year to the fights of the students in a racially equitable and culturally affirming CUNY. And we thank you for using your influence and power as members of PSC and the CUNY community to create the change for our institutions that our students deserve. Thank you.
Thank you. Very powerful. Shortest introduction I've ever had. Angel Martinez is a poet, an adjunct assistant professor based at Hunter College and at Bronx Community College. And he's co-author with Karina Mullen of the article that brought us here together. Angel. Where are you?
Good. Well, thank you for joining us, everybody, today on this powerful occasion. We heard a lot of great speakers so far, and we talked about a lot of struggles that need to be addressed. I'd like to begin with a few of the concluding words of a poem by the Turkish people's poet Nazım Hikmet in his dedication to Paul Robeson. And Nazım Hikmet says, "They are afraid of hope, Robeson, afraid of hope, hope. They are afraid, my songbird with the wings of an eagle. They are afraid of our songs, Robeson." And guess what? He wrote that in 1949, 2 years before the genocide petition was brought to the United Nations. And they still are afraid. They're still afraid of our words, our songs, and our actions. And that's what we have to keep in mind. They are afraid. Even if they thrash against us, they are afraid. Who is afraid? Let's talk about that. Now, one thing we have to keep in mind in this dialogue we're having here, I want to start off with a couple of things. First of all, I'd like to start really talking about Salt of the Earth. Now, a lot of you might have seen that movie, and if you haven't, go ahead and see that. If you know, now, if you've seen the movie already, there's a freeze frame bonus in that film. There's a scene in one of the union meetings in the hall, getting ready to continue their strike. And if you look very carefully at the table, I show this to my students in class, and what I do when I'm in the physical class, I stop the movie and I point out to them on the table, there's a copy of We Charge Genocide. If you look very carefully. That's like my favorite freeze frame bonus of all time. So check it out if you haven't seen it. And if you haven't seen the movie at all, definitely that's a little thing you can go and look for, hunt around for. It's during the union meetings, and it took me a few viewings myself to notice it. And I said to myself, okay, I had to stop this. I mean, this is one of those things you really have to stop and think and take a look at what's going on here. One thing we have to realize that when we talk about genocide, that was pointed out earlier, the genocide petition was just a brief moment in time. For example, last week, during the long weekend, there were many people, myself included, that do not celebrate Thanksgiving because we do not believe in celebrating genocide of the Wampanoag and the Pequot peoples by the Puritan invaders. So we have to remember, when we're talking about racial capitalism, well, it's been with us since the beginning. Genocide has been in this country since the founding of it. And that we need to acknowledge regularly. One thing that could not happen this year is that in Plymouth, they were going to celebrate 400 years of the beginning of that genocide. And of course, CERN plague stopped that from happening. So we definitely got to acknowledge that. So we also have to acknowledge what is violence. Now, I've heard a lot of things from all the panelists today that talk about one kind of violence or another. I mean, when we talk about capitalism, we're talking about a system based on violence and genocide. Look inside what's happening to the CUNY. Adjunctification is economic violence. When you throw thousands of people out of their jobs, it's violence, not just against the faculty and the staff, but also against the students, the staff members' families, and the universities themselves that have a loss in their democratic character when you throw out many people out of their jobs. And this is something we also have to consider. I mean, when you think about capitalism, you have to think about economic violence. And this is apart from the state terrorism we've seen constantly. So we really have to be reminded that, again, none of this is new. This is something that's been with us, and we have to imagine what it would look like without that. Of course, racial capitalism would have to be gone for one thing. And in that sense, we have to consider, here we go. And we really have to consider when we talk about this, we have to use that strong language. Now, if people say genocide is a strong word to use, yeah, right. You have to be using strong language. You have to make them afraid, as Nazim Hikmet said what we have to do. And we also have to consider that we as professors, as staff, as activists, as cultural workers, we need to step up and fight against the genocide that is nonstop. We have to consider what happened in Katrina, genocidal. What happened to Puerto Rico after Maria, genocidal. And we have to see that constantly. Police violence, police terrorism, genocidal. And we have to keep on speaking those terms, because any attempt to not say it is taking away a chance for people to really experience a life free of violence, free of terrorism. And we really have to think about that future they can have, because again, if they're scared of our songs, then we have to keep on singing them. So that's something I really want to really acknowledge. Thank you. And again, you have to remember, we could do this. We could stop this. And imagine, again, a world without this. Now, why is it timely? And I'm really glad Dr. Patterson made the connection from the beginning. Why is this all timely? Because if you consider, like just a couple examples I give, we have to say constantly once again that the United Nations is just a representative of what we have to think about. Again, we have to think about globally. We have to reach across struggles globally. I'm glad we have an international force here today, that international presence, because that's really necessary to understand that we have to fight this together. If genocide is global, then we need to work together constantly. And definitely, if you're in a union, then you're in that fight against genocide too, against genocidal policies, because remember, austerity is violence, it's economic violence. And if you lose your health care, or if your loved ones lose health care, that's violence on the worst scale. And with people dying, that becomes genocidal. And we need to constantly be vigilant about that. And it happens whether we hear about it or not. Most of the time we don't hear about it. That's what's so heavy about the book, because a lot of times we don't know about it. And like I said, that was a small slice of a time. There was more after. Imagine all the state terrorism and violence about those who decide to fight against that genocide. And we have to be realistic. It's not something that's going to come without people losing their lives, because we live in a country that wishes death, with people that wish the death among those that want to fight for truth. I mean, just give you another example. December 4th today marks the 53rd anniversary of the founding of the Poor People's Campaign by Martin Luther King Jr., which was a movement of African Americans, Puerto Ricans, Chicanos, Appalachian whites, and all coming together, all the white, black, Puerto Rican, Chicano, to come together, and indigenous. We cannot forget the indigenous peoples, because they were very strong leadership there. So all the peoples came together and they formed a democratic, internationalist, and socialist community called Resurrection City. Now, remember, it was not considered harmless. The Senate and the Congress hated it, and it was finally destroyed by a combination of force from the FBI, the DC National Guard, the Metropolitan Police of DC, and of course the United States Army. So even in those instances, they do fear us. They fear us greatly. And we have to remember those examples constantly. So I'll just end with another small piece from Nazim Hikmet's piece to Paul Robeson. And it's, again, something we have to think about. They are afraid, Robeson, afraid of the dawn.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to go to Karina and I think try to now open up some discussion and interaction. For the time that we have remaining, we'll be in discussion.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Blanca. Thank you, everyone, for those extremely powerful and enlightening, informative talks. And we were going to have a bit of a moderated discussion, but we're running out of time, and I really want to make sure that everyone gets a chance, that everyone who showed up and taking time out of their day to participate in this forum has a chance to engage and ask questions. So I had a few questions that I can just pose in the meantime as people are raising their hands. And then before sort of turning it over to the speakers to respond, we can open it up, and then and they can decide which questions to answer. I guess one of the questions that I wanted to ask, and oh, by the way, sorry, if you're going to ask a question, please put your hands up. Yes, okay, I see there are a few already coming up. I wanted to ask a question about, two questions. One is about the strategies and tactics of the state and capital to repress revolutionary change in the current moment. So I know quite a few people have talked about different strategies of repression. Charisse, I know in your work you focus on the intersection between anti-Blackness and anti-radicalism. Sarah Raimundo, you talked about it in terms of red tagging, which is, I guess, which is the equivalent of red baiting in the U.S. context, in the anti-communism, that really harkens back to the days of McCarthyism, and reminds us of some of the stories that we were privileged to hear in the beginning about the kinds of repression that people like Paul Robeson and William Patterson faced. So can we think about that in the context of today? Of course, COINTELPRO against Black Power struggle. What does it look like today? I know we've heard different versions of it, from the Democratic Party to police violence and repression, so to NGOization, appropriation of struggle. So let's, if we can have a little bit of a discussion about that. And then also, what is our role as workers, as students in this current moment to challenge genocide? I know that everyone has talked about in that in different ways. Ria, you'd said that we need disruptive behavior. Nellie talked about class struggle. Uju spoke about the importance of the slow work of organizing, talked about also student, the need for coalition, solidarity rooted in shared struggle, and the work of abolition as well. And some and of course Trevor as well, and Sarah, your amazing experiences in participating in strikes that have been heavily repressed. So if you can talk about what it takes to collectively organize in that way. I'm going to open it up. Again, don't feel obligated to answer these questions in any way. I know there are quite a few questions, so we'll start with, we've got Jackie and then Steve. Jackie, would you like to go?
Yeah, I'm very appreciative of the analysis that has been developed today on systemic racial capitalism. But I've been trying to think of what we might do to to take some stand against it. And I know that to do any kind of really major stance to win a lot, to meet people's needs, and ultimately to create an alternative in socialism will require, a vast movement that I can't really talk about briefly here, but I have a very limited suggestion. Paul Robeson, the greatest person in American history, as far as I'm concerned, a genius, a statesman, a political spokesman for radical movement. I mean, there's just nobody any better. He's really great. And what I was thinking was whether we could approach African Americans and the African American movement about the possibility of putting up a statue of Robeson in Harlem. Robeson, who has been rendered invisible, particularly because they are afraid him. This would be a symbolic achievement, but it would be a real symbolic because we get to talk to all these people in the campaign about Robeson and what he stood for. So, you know, we can't do it ourselves, but it'd be worth exploring whether African Americans who are committed to the kind of class struggle that Nellie mentioned and that Robeson represented, and the kind of multinational unity that Robeson stood for. I mean, I could go into it. They took his passport. They wouldn't let him leave the country. Workers in Canada met on the border to hear him sing. So anyway, that's the idea I have. I'd like to explore the possibility. There's a lot going on about removing the statue of slaveholders and all. I think it would be wonderful if African Americans and us would put up a statue to the greatest human being in American history.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that, Jackie. Okay. We also have a question from Steve Zeltzer.
Okay, thanks for having us. I'm Steve Zeltzer from Work Week in San Francisco with the Newspaper Guild. I think one of the things that we face for the first time in my life anyway is the danger of a coup, a fascist coup, a president who's escalating attacks, encouraging racist attacks, xenophobia, and trying to build a fascist movement. And I think that some unions at Vermont AFL-CIO have called for a general strike if he refused to leave office. And I think that the question of mass working class action in the United States is critical. The unions and the AFL-CIO, Trump actually tried to stop the Vermont AFL-CIO from passing this resolution. Well, the question is, if we're threatened with a coup, what is the working class going to do? How are we going to defend ourselves? Mass unemployment, evictions, and a COVID crisis. So that's an issue I think that has to be addressed. The unions, the working class has to have a program to unite the oppressed, unite Blacks, Latinos, all people against these attacks. But one of the political problems is that the AFL-CIO, most unions, are pro-capitalist and pro-imperialist. As a matter of fact, the AFL-CIO, through the National Endowment of Democracy, takes over $30 million for the International Center. So we're taking government money to do international work. And I think that we have to have a campaign that our union should not be taking money for the government, which is oppressing workers around the world, to supposedly support workers in solidarity. And one of the struggles that is going on right now, and I think I obviously am against U.S. imperialism and for this budget of $750 billion. The Democrats aren't even calling for massive cutbacks in the budget in the midst of the COVID crisis, the mass unemployment. There's no demand for a 50% cut in the budget or attack on the military budget. But one of the other issues is the role of China. Okay.
Sorry, Steve, I'm so sorry.
I just want one quick point. The miners in Namibia have been fired, the miners' leadership in Rossi, and there's a fight to defend them. And they're fighting, actually, the Chinese Uranium National Company. So I think, and I'll put it up on the platform, I think we have to have international solidarity, direct solidarity between workers here and workers around the world in action. And that's the way we're going to build internationalism, in my view.
Great. Thank you for raising the question of internationalism. And again, we have labor activists who are here from the Philippines and from South Africa, and I hope they can share their experiences as well. Also, thank you for raising the point about the AFL-CIO. A lot of people have been demanding kicking out the police unions from our unions, but we don't really think about the role of the AFL-CIO in terms of supporting U.S. imperialism and the alignment in that way. And I think we need to really think about the demands that you've raised. So I thank you for raising that point. Okay, there are a couple of other questions. Let's see. Were there? Let me see. Are there hands up? Oh yes. Sorry. We've got Eleanor. Ellie?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. That's why I put Ellie, because I'm not used to being called Eleanor. Thank you very much. I wanted to extend thank you to everyone. I had no idea for sure what this was. I'm a retired New York City educator, but a political activist on so many fronts. And sometimes it feels overwhelming and impossible for us to push back. And yet when I meet all you wonderful people, it just inspires me. I'm 75 years old. I've been demonstrating in the streets. I realize as I get older, I can't be in the streets, but now I'm finding out. And that was the only good thing I can see that COVID brought. And it brought us to be able to communicate via this technology, which is in the hands of Amazon and Google and Microsoft. I'm not a conspiratorialist, but we are facing, when the gentleman said we're facing a coup, the coup's already happened. I'm sorry, I'm afraid. And it's happening around the world. And US imperialism is, it is taking its last breath, but yet the structure of global financial capitalism is still so powerful. And yet within all this, it's just wonderful that people like you in the institutions, which can influence the youth, which will influence, which are doing things to demand change, even on, like the young lady, the young student representative. These are people that I wish I could be with like more, because I know I would learn so much. And Charisse, you informed me about something that I didn't even know about, even though I've been a Black Lives Matter advocate. I've been in so many demos. Can we have more of these is my question to end. Can we have another kind of session like this that spans the universe? It would really be a blessing, I think. Thank you. And Trevor, it was good to see South Africa here. Thank you so much. Thanks, Ellie. Okay, I think we have two more questions. We'll put those questions together and then we'll turn it back to the panel and finish. Let everyone have closing remarks and respond to those questions. So we've got Alex and then Harry.
And can I ask people to please be brief so that more people can talk? Okay, I'm sorry, but we're running out of time.
I'll be very brief. First of all, I want to say I'm very glad to hear about all of this class struggle going on around the world, and I'm very hopeful that the militancy that we've heard about from South Africa and from the Philippines will infuse the struggle that we have going on at CUNY, where it's desperately needed, I think. The question I have is, a number of our great panelists have used this phrase racial capitalism. And I guess my question is, considering that the whole concept of race was born alongside capitalism, what does non-racial capitalism look like? What do you see as the hope for a capitalism without racism? Is that possible? And if you think it is possible, I guess why do you think it's possible? Because the two seem to go hand in hand as far as I can see, but maybe I'm missing something. So that would be my question.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Okay, two more quick questions. Harry and then Omar. Harry?
Okay, can you hear me now? You can hear me? Okay, great. I enjoyed this afternoon, and I'd like to propose as a strategy moving forward that we come together behind the principle of building a cooperative society in a cooperative world. Who can be opposed to that? We move forward by putting this to everyone's imagination. What is a cooperative society? What is a cooperative world? The one that we have right now is actually destroying our very planet. And the cooperative world may have the solution to avoiding all this. So if we could just get behind a mantra and say it over and over and over again and never stop saying that we need a cooperative world where we don't have people being shot and killed in South Africa or anywhere else in the world. So let's get behind this idea and have people try to discover what it would be, what it would look like, what would it mean together.
Thank you, Harry. Thanks for that. Thank you. Omar, I think you're next.
And then we go to the panel.
Yes.
Omar.
Hi, how's it going, everybody? I'm a student at City College and a member of Progressive Labor Party, a communist party trying to garner multiracial unity to kind of change the system that we're talking about. And so, trying to bring these things together. People were talking earlier about the need for actively kind of resisting and fighting back. And so, in that vein of thought, how can we continue to resist and confront and challenge the system? Like what tangible steps can we take in garnering more momentum and support from our peers, from students, from faculty members to kind of push forward a CUNY strike? Because that's something that's been in the works recently. And I think, taking something tangible from this conversation and how we can move forward and having that at the forefront of people's minds is very important because, I think these conversations are all well and good, but I think particularly in the circumstances we're dealing with from this pandemic, I find it very hard often to think about what the next steps are moving forward tangibly. So if anybody would like to offer anything on how we can really try to gain momentum for something actionable, directly challenging the CUNY system and make our voices heard to other people and not just within this group.
Maybe some of the panelists might want to address that from CUNY. From their experience from their organizing on campus. Actually, Brooklyn is the most successful, right?
I can share some sentiments if this is the first question we're addressing. It's Amber Rivero. So, there are student coalitions amongst CUNY that are not connected to any formal like student government body that work alongside student governments or university student senate, and that's a very powerful source of advocacy and change because they're not restricted per se to any of the like bylaws that govern CUNY, and they're just like individual students and faculty who come together to try to create that outside pressure. But there's also just the ability to kind of like rally the students on your local campus, whether they're in student government or a part of student life or student organizations, to just understand the power and the rights that they have even within the system, and to also show up. So we constantly have these notices of New York City public hearings at City Council around the conditions within CUNY, whether it's the mental health resources or lack thereof, whether it's support for adjuncts and what's happening with them, number of things, childcare, how parents are being supported. New York City Council often has oversight hearings and you can come and testify. And if you don't want to testify in person, you can submit your testimony to the hearings address or email address within 72 hours after the hearing has taken place. That's a very powerful way to make your voice known. But collectively, I think just coming together and organizing on your campus and reaching out to all the other students across the community who are also facing similarities or disparities on their campus, and coming together with the faculty and staff that are a part of wanting to support that, and collectively deciding how to make our voices heard by showing up to these public hearings, by forming resolutions and asking our elected officials to affirm and call on CUNY for these changes and these resolutions is just one way to create change.
Great. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, Amber. Great. So let's open that up. I'd like to first, there are a couple, I'd like to go back to this question, but I know that there has been a discussion. Charisse has been answering on chat about racial capitalism. If you would like to just say a few words about that, Charisse, and also anything else you'd like to come in on, and then we can go back to each of the panelists. Thanks.
You know, I want to cede time to my activist, organizer, scholar colleagues who are on the ground. I'm just a lowly academic, so I don't want to take up too much space. There's a lot of writing about racial capitalism at this point. All I can say is if you don't like the analytical framework, don't use it. But there is no non-racial capitalism. That's not the point. The point is to name the processes of racialization and the structure of racism that is endemic in capitalism as such. Many people have written about this. There's been debates going back and forth. Some people use the term racialized capitalism. Some people use racist capitalism, but it's all getting at the point that we have to take racism and processes of racialization seriously. It is also an epistemological question because it centers things like super exploitation, expropriation, and this idea of primitive accumulation as ongoing, which means you have to look at racialized people, you have to look at spaces in the global South. When you look at dispossession, you have to look at indigenous populations. And so it is simply that intervention. And it is moving beyond the sort of free enterprise narrative to look at capitalism as a world system. So that's what I'll contribute there.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Excellent. Let's move on to Ria. Would you like to respond to either the question about racial capitalism or about organizing and what can be done in the current moment?
If Omar could just re-articulate that, the synthesis of his question.
I think the question was around strike or readiness and strike mobilizing in that direction in relation to the resolution that was just passed by the PSC. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Omar, I didn't mean to, is that correct?
Sorry, yes, I was just going to type in the chat. Yeah, you nailed it on the head.
Okay.
Well, I mean, vibing off of what Amber was starting to say in terms of student organizing. So with ARC, I think the biggest challenge is faculty, staff, and students. So faculty are kind of the at the forefront of ARC, and it's much more of a challenge, even in terms of like the union, the ways that staff concerns and precarity are not foregrounded in relation to faculty concerns. And so, I mean, there has been a lot going on. We've been talking about this so much throughout the summer. So there have been a resolution from the higher education officers. And so we're making strides in that way, but there is a particular considerations around precarity of staff that has also, and also the time constraints that staff are working year round, and that staff are working much more of a full-time schedule. So it makes it much more difficult to staff to participate in the organizing in the way that faculty do. So I think those kinds of, I mean, we're making initiatives at cross-title conversation. So the union's been doing a lot of phone banking, and that's been a big, having cross-title phone banking has been really helpful for faculty, for example, to better understand concerns and issues around staff. And then the issue with student organizing also, it's just been really difficult with the pandemic, that the number of student organizations that are registered has gone down by so much because students just aren't on campus. So that's been a lot harder to mobilize. But I think the things that Amber was saying, students have still come together with a number of resolutions that they then take to a number of bodies. I think what happened with the student op-ed is really significant, because also within the union organizing, our staff often emphasizes this for ways that I think faculty lose sight of, but that we're here for our students. And so if we have that at the foreground of our organizing, that the higher class sizes, the cutting adjuncts, all of this affects our students. So I think foregrounding that CUNY is here to serve students. And so it has, and in terms of strike readiness, I think it is, I mean, there's a frustration and a tension between the slow moving of like the 10,000 conversations that we need to have. But at the same time, even as I was saying with our petition, we have colleagues who are uncomfortable with even the word white supremacy. So there both needs to happen. I mean, we have to make these, I was saying about direct action, and yes, we understand as a union our power is withholding our labor, but that's only effective if we have enough people that understand that are willing to work in solidarity for that. So we're trying to do things on multiple levels at one time. So
thank you. Excellent. Thanks for that. Can we also, it would be great to hear from Sarah about, and then we'll move to Trevor, about your experiences with the strike and what it took to sort of build that momentum, as Doug said in the chat, to build towards a strike, in particular that relationship between the student body and the workers, the faculty, how that sort of solidarity was built, and how that's what you think it takes to make a successful strike.
Hi, thank you. So, of course, we are very grateful to the students for really initiating this particular strike, which is a political action more than the strikes that we're usually familiar with, like the strikes that are being launched by unions that would demand, for example, wage hikes and other economic benefits and so on and so forth. So I think it was very crucial that the students were able to connect the demands of this strike with the current campaign to end tyranny in the land, so that politicizing, for example, academic freedom, politicizing notions of academic excellence, how these requirements are no longer achievable within the current setup, and being able to relate that to the larger frame is really crucial. And so building unities wasn't really difficult, because I think the movement against tyranny, or the movement that calls for Duterte's ouster, has already been, has taken a momentum, especially in universities. But what we are also learning, as we have learned from other unions in the Philippines, is that it is important that in the age of imperialism, the organizing of the Filipino working class and campaigning for rights and welfare are inseparable from, or say, academic freedom, the freedom to assembly and so on and so forth, are inseparable from the demand for social amelioration, for wageless labor of informal workers, slum dwellers, landless peasants, and indigenous peoples, to make this strike a venue where the drain of value from from the global south to the global north can actually be articulated, and how primitive accumulation is in fact is still here, and it is in fact genocide. And so yeah, I think it's important that this particular strike is able to challenge not only academic limitations, not only the inefficiency of this government, but challenge imperialist domination, because it's what really makes this particular strike a political fight that encompasses economic demands. Thank you.
Thanks to you for that, Sarah. Yeah, for connecting so many dots, and it's a really powerful response. And I think it also links up to what Charisse was saying earlier about how we need to understand primitive accumulation is ongoing, and that is one of the many things that racial capitalism does as a concept for us, both in the context of within the imperial metropoles, within settler colonial states, racial capitalist states, but also in terms of how imperialism functions in the global South, and also for reminding us of the importance of genocide as the framing, and what does it mean to put an anti-racist, racial justice, anti-imperialist struggle at the heart of any labor action. So I think that's really a crucial point. Thank you for bringing us back to that. Trevor, if we can go to you, if you have, I know that you said you were speaking about the power of workers, and at the end of the day, that's what we have to struggle with, and the power that we have to achieve the kinds of transformations that we would like to see. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences in South Africa in relation to labor struggle, and what we can learn from South Africa?
Okay, so from the Marikana massacre, the main thing is that one can view it from two perspectives: as a tragic moment where workers were killed, and then one can also look at what it represents in terms of what happens when workers come together, share their anger, share their strength, and then unite behind a vision of alternatives. So I think in many cases, workers move forward when they turn their anger. Well, firstly, let's say with COVID, first there is fear of dying and whatever. And also when workers are alone and separated and isolated, then there is fear. But when they come together, when they share their fear, and then the fear goes down and the anger kicks in, and then from the anger grows, the need for action to do something, and then the confidence of fighting shoulder to shoulder, and then the hope grows. But of course, there will be many problems and many obstacles to building that collectivism, that collective struggle. But I think the worst thing which can happen is when workers, or any movement for that matter, fights without a vision of alternatives. Then, even if there's upsurges, there's gains, they are easily rolled back. So I think that those workers who were involved, who were part of Marikana, and the millions who watched, what was happening in Marikana, they will never forget that. And that vision, that belief that we can do it. So I think our task as activists, is to point workers, people's eyes to that power, to that strength. And we know that every moment where workers have built that confidence, that hope, it lays footsteps for the future. So I think I can just summarize that ordinary people, it's just that now it's unemployed and employed, but this is all the result of capital. Some are made employable, others. But I think the thing to do is to recognize that organic capacity of the working class, and also the collective working class organization, mobilization, and agency, because that is what has made possible, the best, all the gains that we have made. And then we can build on it so that going forward, we can draw on it and be able to have victories. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that very powerful way of framing it. And Good fighting words also to think about as we leave this forum today. But I do want to have our last closing words. We've got Uju and then followed by Angel. Uju, if you could tell us a little bit, because I know you also have great your organizing experience, and especially thinking about rooting along the lines of what Sarah was saying, rooting the demands of workers, of students within the school, whether it's the public K through 12 or university, in the larger community, the needs of the larger community of families, members, of the kind of bargaining for the common good. So if you can sort of talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
Sure.
Or anything.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I mean, two things I just want to kind of speak to. And again, I've learned so very much. So thank you again for organizing this forum and for inviting me. And I look forward to future discussions. One thing I think that we need to do quickly, and that has been very absent from our organizing in the United States, is uniting across kind of educational spaces. So thinking about kind of the attacks on higher education, public higher education, and public K-12 education as one, and as and unfortunately we haven't had the strength in kind of those worker movements, but I think we can see the connections and need to build them up as much as possible. And yeah, definitely, just in line with what you were saying, Sarah, and what you're speaking to, Karina, I wanted to kind of give one example from a case on the Upper West Side that I have that I looked to that I think is quite informative around this question of primitive accumulation, and how kind of then the demand of what we envision and what we build has to be linked to building with the communities that you talked about, Sarah. So so there's one school, for example, that went through a struggle of from the 1970s through the 1980s, establishing one dual language program in a public elementary school, right? And that program was, again, supposed to kind of forward the vision of the movement for community control of schools, but it grew out of the very concrete and local work of Operation Move In and Implemete in the area, which were Puerto Rican-led squatting-based movements, housing, kind of addressing housing needs and concerns in the community, addressing questions of police brutality. And so that it wasn't ever siloed out struggles, right? How they understood kind of fighting for this program within the school, very much akin to kind of what was documented in the film you talked about, Karina, Demand the Impossible. It was about kind of how we understand that as also connected to, right, establishing a program that serves us, that we need, that builds our strength, builds our power, reflects us in the school, is connected to building that power and community outside of the school in terms of a longer term struggle as well. So never about kind of, first we need the program and then we need to kind of bring in the community for the, to kind of think about how the program might serve the community, but always again in alignment with and growing out of that deep kind of solidarity. But also kind of, again, where I think others spoke earlier in the panel about this, about where we even see knowledge, right? Knowledge produced, knowledge preserved, and what knowledge we're then seeking to build forward in the schools and educations that we fight for.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Uju. I really love that concept of deep solidarity, and that's what we really need to work for, and to avoid the siloing off, as you said, of our struggles. So thanks for that. And we've got our last but not least, Angel, would you like to close us off with some final comments?
Okay, I'll keep it short as possible. Thank you. Whatever we call capitalism, I think we can all agree on one thing. It's dying. Whatever we call it, it is dying. And we need to acknowledge that. And that's something that we have to realize, that monsters are the most violent when they are dying, and they want to take as many people with them as possible. And we need to do everything we can to stop that. So how can we stop that? Well, we realize that everything we gained is through a struggle. I mean, things like public education, things like public health, things like people's culture. They call those things communists. So you know what I say? Let's take what we fought for and throw out the garbage, and imagine a new world. Imagine new societies that are free of imperialism, free of colonialism, without this monster. And if it's as it's meant to die, then just let it just go where it needs to go. But make sure that we save people's lives before it could take any more.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Angel, and bringing it back to the concept of genocide, which is really what brought us here together in the first place. And we are united and need to build deep solidarity around the struggle against that. And I like just to end with Sharice's comment also, well, from her article about building an anti-racist socialism as an alternative and an antidote to racial capitalism. Thank you everyone for being here today. This was such an amazing discussion. Thank you for taking so much time out of your schedules, to all of the presenters and everyone in the audience. This was such a powerful discussion, and I really hope it's just the beginning of many to come, and ongoing organizing work that needs to be done. And I've learned so much from all of you, so thank you. And thank you to the PSC for hosting this, to Samantha for your amazing work, Doug, amazing work also behind the scenes, Blanca, it was amazing working with you together on this, and the whole international committee. Please, if anyone is interested in this kind of discussion, we have these discussions once a month in the international committee. It's an amazing group, committed anti-imperialists, people who are committed to overcoming racial capitalism and the fight against genocide. So join us. And there is an email here that Doug's email, if someone could place it there again. We will send out an email to everyone who's registered, also with a Google Doc with the incredible reading list that all the panelists have helped to put together, with their amazing work and with amazing work that has inspired them, including the PDF of We Charge Genocide. So thank you again, and take care, everyone. Stay healthy and safe, and hope to see you again soon.
La lucha continúa. Hasta la victoria, siempre.
Yes.